Say, Doc, okay to take this car to the body shop down the street? Joe's not sure we can handle the door alignment because we haven't got any special body tools.
Well, Hank, this job won't need any special tools. Ordinary hand tools will work out fine. In fact, I've been meaning to show you and Joe how doors can be adjusted so we won't have to send that kind of work out of our shop. Suppose you pull it over next to that Chrysler, and then Tech and I'll give you and Joe the inside story on door alignment.
Okay, Doc.
Hello, Joe. Tech and I are going to talk about mechanical work on bodies. I've lined up this Plymouth and that Chrysler Windsor as examples.
Yeah, Joe. We're going to prove that any mechanic can handle door alignment.
Well, I'm from Missouri, Tech. Doc's going to have to show me it's really easy to do.
You and me both, Joe. Doc's got to show me, too.
Okay, fellas, I think we can convince you. But first, I'd like Joe to tell us how a mechanic should know when a door fits properly.
Fits properly? Well, a door that's right is centered in the body opening. The spacing around the door is nice and even at the top, bottom, and sides. In addition, the door must be flush with the panels right next to it all the way around. You can adjust that front fender, you know, to help alignment at the front edge of the door. Here's something else. A door must open and close easily. There should be a very slight lift when the guide block passes over the striker plate. That supports the rear of the door and keeps it from sounding off when the car's in motion. Finally, the door should make a good seal against water and dust.
That's right, Joe. That sealing job's mighty important. Getting a good seal and nice-looking, even spacing are basic to all properly fitted doors. Incidentally, you might have to settle for a compromise on a door adjustment when you even up the spacing. That's okay as far as looks are concerned, but don't ever settle for a compromise on sealing. It doesn't pay. The door weather strip is designed to keep dirt and water out. If the door is properly fitted to the opening, that weather strip will be squeezed tight enough to give a good seal between the door and the body.
Attaboy, Doc. Now, while you're doing a little review on body service, why don't you give the boys a brush-up on door movements you can make by adjusting the hinges?
That's just what I'm going to do, Tech. Any mechanic can adjust hinges, and the boys won't have any trouble getting the hang of it. For instance, all doors can be moved up and down, fore and aft, or out and in by simply adjusting the hinges, taking advantage of the oversized mounting holes. All you have to know is how to do this with the different types of hinges used.
What's different about the hinges, Doc?
Well, there are two basic hinge designs, the box type and the strap type. I'll explain the box type hinge first. The box type hinge is mounted in the body pillar and secured to the pillar by 4 screws. An extra screw inside the box attaches the hinge to the cowl panel. The hinge strap is assembled on a pivot pin inside the box section. This strap is fastened to the door by 3 cap screws, anchored to a tapped plate.
Swell, Doc. Along with that hinge design story, why not tell the boys about adjustments they can make to move doors having this type of hinge?
It's a good suggestion, Tech. But before I go into that, I want to cover some general things to keep in mind. For instance, when you start out to reset a door to correct its alignment, always remember to inspect the overall spacing first.
Yeah, and there's one particular place to begin that inspection, eh?
Right. You should always start by checking spacing at the parting line between the forward edge of the front door flange and the rear edge of the fender and cowl to see that it's equal, top and bottom. Next, check for equal spacing between the top of the door and the drip molding. Then, inspect the rear door for equal spacing all around and for alignment with the front door. Another thing, when adjusting hinges, turn the screws out just enough so you can slide the door where you want it. That gives you better control of the adjustment. And when you tighten the screws, use a torque wrench and tighten them to 20 foot-pounds.
What's the floor jack for, Doc?
Well, that's put under the door to control the movement of the door and to hold it in place while you tighten the hinge screws. Now, let's suppose this door is too high or too low in its opening. Put the jack under the door as close to the front edge as possible. Loosen the screws which hold body hinges to the body pillar. Raise or lower the door to even up top and bottom spacing. The oversized holes in the pillar should provide enough vertical movement. But if you should need more, remove the door handles and trim panel. Scribe a line around both hinge straps as a check on how much you move the door. Loosen the screws in both straps and use the jack to control the movement of the door. Then, tighten the screws to 20 foot-pounds.
I see. I suppose you open and close the door a couple of times next, but then readjust the striker plate if necessary to get a very slight rise when the door is closed.
Yes, Joe. And when opening that door, push it wide open against the check strap a few times. That's a good test to see if the hinges will stay where you adjusted them. Now, if you get a case where there's too much gap between the rear edge of the front fender and door, and it's necessary to move the door forward, here's how you do it. Put the jack under the rear corner. Raise the jack to support the door weight. Loosen the cap screws, holding the upper hinge strap. Carefully raise the jack to pivot the upper half of the door forward. Then, tighten the screws. Next, loosen the lower hinge screws and remove the jack. Carefully pull down on the upper rear corner of the door. That makes it pivot on the upper hinge, moving the lower half of the door forward. Then tighten the screws.
When you move the door forward, better be sure you've got at least a 1/4-inch overlap of the striker plate on the rotor.
Good point, Tech. You need at least a 1/4-inch overlap to hold the door securely closed. You can shim the striker plate if necessary to maintain that 1/4-inch overlap. Now, if you get a case where the spacing between the door and the fender is unequal, too wide at the top or bottom, you can adjust it by using that same idea.
Well, how's that done, Doc?
Just loosen the screws in the hinge you want to move and pivot the door around the other hinge to equalize the spacing.
If you move the door at only one hinge, be sure to loosen the screws in the other hinge, and then retighten them to relieve the strain at that point.
Thanks, Tech. That's a good point. Here's another alignment example. If you find the lower half of the front door in too far and the upper half out too far, tackle it this way. First, open the door fully and place the jack under the rear corner. Then, loosen the 5 screws which hold the upper box hinge to the pillar. Raise the jack slowly. That moves the upper half of the door in toward the body. Tighten the screws. Next, loosen the screws which hold the lower hinge to the body pillar. Raise the jack carefully. That moves the lower door half away from the body. Tighten the screws, and you've corrected that condition.
Okay, Doc. Now, what do you do if the edge of the front door rubs on the pillar right here?
Well, in a case of that kind, Joe, you first loosen the screws which hold the upper hinge to the door. Then, carefully pull the upper rear corner of the door down, just enough to move the front edge away from the body. Tighten the screws, and you've corrected the rubbing condition.
Everything you've shown us so far looks fairly easy. Those box hinge adjustments don't seem too tough to figure out.
You're on the ball, Hank. Any mechanic can handle all those operations. But right now, somebody better turn the record over so we can finish up adjustments on doors using the other type hinges.
You mentioned other type hinges, Doc. What are they?
They're strap-type hinges, Hank, but there's a difference in the way they're mounted. Take this one, for example. It's an L-mounted hinge. The pillar half of the L-mounted strap hinge is fastened to the hinge pillar by screws. It's partially concealed behind the face panel of the pillar. The mounting screws are secured by cage nuts in the pillar. You can see the outer row of 2 screws when you open the door. To get at the inner row of 2 screws, you just remove the 2 snap-in plugs in the pillar. You follow that?
Yep, right up with you. What about the door part of that hinge?
Well, that door half is held up by 3 cap screws secured in a floating tapped plate inside the door. You get at those screws by removing the door inside handles, garnish molding, and trim panel. Horizontally slotted, slightly oversized holes in the hinge pillar provide in and out and up and down movement of the door, just as you get with the pillar half of the box-type hinge.
Right. And those slotted and slightly oversized holes where the door half of the hinge is mounted give you a little 4.5 movement of the door on the hinge. You also get a little up and down adjustment of the door at this point.
The important thing to remember is that those adjustments we made on doors using box hinges, you can also make on doors using L-mounted strap hinges. Removing the snap-in plugs to get at the screws is the only difference.
Say, that's right. The hinge is mounted to the door the same way, so the door can be adjusted the same way, too.
Sure it can. Now, let's talk about the other type of strap hinge, the U-mounted hinge. Each half of the U-mounted strap-type hinge is made with a slight offset. It's mounted to the face of the door in a slight recess. The pillar half of the hinge is mounted in a slight recess in the face of the pillar by 3 screws. Those screws thread into a tapped plate in the pillar. You can see all 3 screws when the door is open. And you can get in and out movement of the door due to the slotted screw holes in the pillar. To get a fore and aft door adjustment when necessary, remove the hinge and bend it in an arbor press or in a bench vise using a wooden block and hammer. And you can move the door back from the hinge pillar by adding a shim behind the hinge.
Why take it off? Can't you bend it where it is?
You do that, Joe, and I'll bend you like a pretzel.
Yes, indeed, Joe. Never bend the hinge while it's mounted. That will bend the metal of the pillar or door. Bent metal tends to spring back to its original shape, putting you right back where you were before.
Okay. Now, how do you get an up and down movement with that U-mounted hinge?
Well, Joe, you get a slight vertical adjustment thanks to the slotted, oversized mounting holes in the body pillar. But on the door half of this hinge, no sliding adjustment is provided. The screws just secure that strap tightly to the door pillar.
That figures, Doc. Those screws just fit the holes.
How about showing the boys how to move doors in and out with this type of hinge, Doc?
Good idea, Tech. Here's how that's handled. Since the only movement you can get is from the body pillar half of the hinge, loosen the 3 screws which hold the upper hinge to the pillar. If the door needs to be moved out, pull down on the upper rear corner of the door. That moves the upper half of the door out from the pillar. But if the door has to go in, use the jack to raise the lower rear corner. That moves the upper half of the door in toward the pillar. After either adjustment, tighten the screws. If the lower half of the door needs to be moved, loosen the 3 attaching screws which hold the lower hinge to the pillar. If the door is going to be moved out, use the jack to raise the lower rear corner of the door. That pivots the lower half of the door out away from the pillar. Pull down on the upper rear corner to pivot the lower half of the door in, and after these adjustments, of course, tighten the screws.
Good going, Doc. Now, how about those cases where you can't get enough door movement to make it fit right?
Oh, yeah. Sometimes adding or removing shims at the body bolts is the only way to get the door fit you need. You see, there just might be a misalignment of the body on the frame that keeps a hinge adjustment from correcting a certain condition.
At which body bolts do you add or remove shims?
It depends on what condition you're trying to correct. And another thing, body alignment depends a lot on proper tightening of the body bolts.
Tech's right. In fact, before adding or removing any shims, you'd better check those body bolts.
How tight should those body bolts be, Doc?
18 foot-pounds for all models, Joe. But be sure the nut is free on the bolt. A rusty condition can give you false torque readings. Now, suppose the front door on a car remains high at its rear edge. In this case, there may be too many shims at the number 2 body bolt, keeping the door opening out of square. So check for excessive shims first. On the other hand, you might sometimes find too few shims at the number 1 body bolt. If so, you'll have to add shims to tilt the front hinge pillar back at its top in relation to the frame.
I follow you, Doc. Any other examples?
Well, suppose you've done all the hinge adjusting you can, but the rear door still binds near the top at the lock pillar. To correct this condition, add shims at the number 4 body bolt. That will raise the lock pillar away from the upper rear edge of the door. Keep adding shims until the spacing is even on both sides of the rear door. You may have to add shims at the number 3 body bolt to support the body on a straight line contour.
Fine, Doc. Now tell the boys when they might have to remove shims.
Okay, Tech. Too many shims at the number 4 bolt will cause binding of a rear door at the bottom. Removing shims will tend to pull the rear lock pillar down, relieving the bind.
Incidentally, the charts which came with this kit show the location of the body bolts we've talked about. They've got torque specifications, too.
And remember that you first have to loosen all bolts on the side where you're going to add or remove shims. Then, use the wood block and the floor jack to raise the body slightly at the point where the shimming is to be changed. After installing shims, snug down the bolts and check door alignment before you finally tighten the bolts to specifications.
Okay, Doc. Hank and I will follow that to the letter.
Nice going, Doc. I wonder what Joe and Hank think now about door alignment jobs any mechanic can do.
Well, speaking for myself, Tech, I'm convinced that these adjusting operations are easy to do all right.
Same here, Tech. I think I can handle those door fitting jobs myself now.
Glad to hear that, fellas. When we keep body work in our own shop, we gain two ways. We have better control over the cost, and we can control the quality much better.
You're so right, Doc. And controlling that quality means more thoroughly satisfied customers. That naturally keeps all of us on top in the service business.